get the best possible plan available in attacking King David and his men. So if Ahithophel was encouraging speed, Hushai was encouraging caution. And if you'll remember, Absalom chose Hushai's advice to be cautious in moving forward. Consequently, we saw last Sunday night that Ahithophel took his own life after Absalom made that decision. He could not imagine how things were going to turn out good for him with Absalom choosing his advice, choosing Hushai's advice over Ahithophel's. And so again, Ahithophel took his own life. The end of chapter 17, David's troops were refreshed. They were refreshed with food. They were refreshed with drink. They were refreshed with sleep. And that sets the stage for the beginning of chapter 18. Again, remembering Absalom, even though an enemy, he was still a son. Look at verse 1 of 2 Samuel 18. And David numbered the people who were with him and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. And David then sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, and 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. Now, I want to stop right here. I commend King David for his desire to lead his people even in the field of battle, because you remember what happened previously back in chapter 12 when David did not do that. While all the other kings were out at war, where was David? Where he shouldn't have been, and got into a load of trouble. So David was going to go out and lead the way for his people. Verse 3, but the people answered, you shall not go out, for if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor if half of us die will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now, for you are now more help to us in the city. So I think that's pretty good advice. Pretty good advice that if David goes out and he gets killed, well, it's downhill for all of his soldiers, downhill for all of his people. They're going to be captured upon David's death. And so him staying back was probably smarter. Then the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, saying, so he's sending these guys out, and they're leaders of hundreds and thousands of soldiers, but then he gives them some very specific instructions as it relates to Absalom. Remember, even though an enemy, still a son. Verse 5, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom. By the way, I think what King David has in mind here, that even though if the roles were reversed, Absalom would not be sparing the life of the man that he considered to be standing in his way of being the one and only king. Even though Absalom would not feel this way, David felt that Absalom still was not beyond a father's forgiveness. And brothers and sisters, aren't you grateful and thankful that you and I are not beyond our Heavenly Father's forgiveness? Whatever we may do, disobedient, sinful, living in rebellion, God, our Heavenly Father, never thinks that we're beyond forgiveness. And I think that's what you see here with King David and the instructions that he gave his captains regarding Absalom. Verse 6, so the people went out into the field of battle against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim, and the people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David. So this is David's armies overthrowing Absalom's armies. And a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. So evidently there's very tumultuous terrain that they were dealing with that was causing more problems than the warfare itself. Then Absalom met the servants of David. And Absalom rode on a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, or boughs of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, and the mule which was under him went on. Now this is a crazy picture. Obviously, I cannot identify with Absalom in any way, but in all seriousness, I mean, I'm just imagining this man's hair and how much it had to have been to cause this. He's hanging there. And a certain man saw it and told Joab. Remember, Joab was one of David's captains. And said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. So Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him? Why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. Because remember, even though he was an enemy, he was still a son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise, I would have dealt falsely against my own life, for there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. Then Joab said, I cannot linger with you. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. And then 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. So it seems that Joab and his spears to the heart or what killed Absalom, but just to make sure that he was dead, these 10 young men caused further harm. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a large pit in the woods and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it's called Absalom's monument. You know, it's interesting what Absalom said about himself, for I have no son. Listen to 2 Samuel 14:27, earlier in the book. To Absalom were born 3 sons and 1 daughter whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance. So evidently and unfortunately, Absalom's sons had preceded him in death by the time that he says this in verse 18. But here in verse 18 we have what I would direct your attention to as the first lesson or principle tonight that I just want to remind you of. Pride goes before the fall. Do you know that to be true? Absalom had set up this pillar for himself in the king's valley, called the pillar after his own name, because he thought he was going to be the king of Israel. And then here we see in chapter 18 that he loses his life. Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Brothers and sisters, be careful of thinking too highly of yourselves, because as soon as you do, the Lord and the world will humble us quickly. Let's continue on, verse 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, Let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies. But remember, even though an enemy, he's still a son. And Joab said to him, You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead. It seems that Joab had some decency in trying to spare David this news. Or maybe he was just scared as to the truth of how Absalom was killed. Then Joab said to the Cushite, Go tell the king what you have seen. So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. So Joab doesn't let Ahimaaz go, but he does send the Cushite. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite. So he says, Let me go second. And so Joab said, Why will you run, my son, since you have no news already? But whatever happens, he said, let me run. So he said to him, Run. Then Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Isn't that funny how the biblical writers include that? That he ran a little bit faster than the Cushite. We see that in the Gospel of John. You know, the Gospel of John, John talks about him and Peter on resurrection morning and the race that took place between the two of them, evidently. Verse 24, Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. And then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, If he's alone, there's news in his mouth. And he came rapidly and drew near. And then the watchman saw another man running. The watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "There's another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He's a good man and comes with good news." So David's experience with Ahimaaz was good, and he was favorable to him, and thought that surely he was going to be bringing him good news. Verse 28, so Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." The king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." The king said, "Turn aside, stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. And just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose up against you." Well, who did that include? Well, that included Absalom. And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you to do you harm be like that young man." In fact, Absalom was no longer living. His life had been taken. And then the king was deeply moved. Verse 33, then the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Second reminder or lesson or principle that I would just remind you of tonight, that the loss of loved ones is extremely difficult. And many of you in this room know better than me because you've experienced that. The death of a child, the death of a spouse, the death of multiple spouses, the death of a friend, a neighbor, co-worker. The loss of loved ones is very, very hard. And brothers and sisters, I want you to know tonight that when you go through that, it is good and right and appropriate for you to grieve. For you to grieve, and whatever that may mean for you. You do not have to bury your head in the sand and pretend that nothing has happened or everything is okay when it's not. Because losing a loved one is hard. David knew that. How many times does he use the word son in this single verse? 5 times. Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom. If only I died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Because even though he was an enemy, he was still a son. I think we see a good example in the Gospel of John. Remember John chapter 11, verse 32, then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Do you remember this story? Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus, who had died. And Jesus, when he found out about it, he didn't come as soon as he could. He waited. And Mary got word of that, and she was mad. "If you'd have come, Jesus, My brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit. That's very similar wording to what we just read a moment ago in 2 Samuel 18, verse 33. It says that the king was deeply moved. Here it says Jesus, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see. We want you to do something." And then there's that verse, the verse we know, shortest English verse in the New Testament. Jesus wept. Why did Jesus weep? I mean, he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. Well, I think the Jews, they were on to something in verse 36 when they said, "See how he loved him." See how Jesus loved him. But Jesus wasn't the only one who loved him. Mary and Martha loved him. That community loved him. And they were hurting. And Jesus was hurting because they were hurting. And I would say to you tonight that Jesus hurts when you hurt, brothers and sisters. So it's right and appropriate to grieve, because the death and the losing of loved ones is very, very hard. The last thing that I want to remind you of tonight, I want you to think about this. Sin has long-lasting consequences. Sin has long-lasting consequences. I want you to go back to 2 Samuel chapter 12. The prophet Nathan spoke these words, but it was the Lord speaking through him, talking to King David. "Now therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife." Does God forgive sin? Absolutely. And with the Lord, when we ask for forgiveness, do we get it immediately and with a clean slate? I believe we do. But there are long-lasting consequences of our sin. Two of David's sons, Amnon, do you remember Amnon? Do you remember how Amnon died? He was murdered by Absalom. Why? Because Amnon had raped his half-sister, David's daughter, Absalom's sister. By the way, if you remember reading just a moment ago, Absalom named his daughter after his sister, Tamar. Amnon was violently killed. And then what happened to Absalom? Also violently killed. And the fulfillment of this prophecy in 2 Samuel 12:10. Why? Because David's sin, but not just David's, brothers and sisters. Our sin has long-lasting consequences. And so let us run from sin and run to righteousness and obedience and holiness and faithfulness when given the opportunity. Absalom was an enemy, but he was still David's son. And it hurt David when Absalom died. God bless you for being here tonight. I'm grateful and thankful that we can conclude the Lord's Day together in the Lord's Word. and getting ready for this next week. Let's stand together. We'll have our parting declaration and then our benediction. And don't forget, I won't see you on Wednesday. I'll see you Monday and Tuesday and Thursday if you're in and around the office. But if I originally will have only seen you on Wednesday, it'll be next Sunday before I see you. But he said, the things which are impossible with men are possible with God.
There is coming a day when no heartache shall come, no more clouds in the sky, no more tears to dim the eye. All is peace forevermore on that happy golden shore. What a day, glorious day that will be. What a day that will be when my Jesus I shall see, and I look upon his face, the one who saved me by his grace, when he takes me by the hand and leads me through the promised land. What a day, glorious day